Greetings, friends! How do Christianity's three major branches stack up to each other in terms of overall numbers of adherents across the world? And how do they compare with each other in geography, in the actual land, which has a dominant number of adherents of these three branches of Christianity? Of course, there may be other branches of Christianity, but generally speaking, there's the Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant. So we can think of this in terms of geopolitics, a very simplistic look at geopolitics, not a sufficient one. I'm just doing this for expediency's sake, because we can't go on forever here in this video. So a very simplistic look at a geopolitical aspect. When I say geopolitics, in terms of cultural blocks and power, influence in the world. We're not considering the economies or military capabilities of these countries, but we're assuming to some extent, and it's not perfect, that when there is a religious group, when the people identify themselves as an adherent to a religion, that forms its own culture to some extent. That culture may overlap with other ethnic identity, but that does form, historically at least, a culture. In Western civilization, it was mainly Protestant or Catholic, or mostly Catholic before the Reformation. And of course, further east, there was the Byzantine world and the Eastern Orthodox world. So one thing I should mention, obviously I've spoken in the past that we are all religious. You can't really get rid of religion, even if you claim to get rid of Christianity or whatever, because we all, in the deeper sense, we all live our lives according to some absolute values, some notion of good and bad, even though we try to deny it and say we're relativists. At the end of the day, we all live in a religious way, in the sense that there are certain rituals we perform when we're dealing with other people. We may just think of them as mundane things that aren't even worth consideration, but we do things for a reason, and this informs every aspect of our life. There are certain moral codes we live by. There are certain aspects of goodness or beauty or the good life or hopes, things we're striving for, and that we can never get away from that. So I'm looking at religion in the more superficial way, like people who actually belong to a group and they express membership in that group. But let's just be aware of that when we see on these surveys people who say none or non-specified. It's like, yes, it just means they're not religious in the more traditional sense. But of course, everyone must have some religious system they fit into. I just wanted to clear that up. And of course, I got all this information from the World Fact Book of the Central Intelligence Agency. Maybe you can't trust them for everything, but I don't have any reason to doubt these statistics. So we'll just be looking at the population in each of these countries. I'll give you the percentage of the population which adheres to one of these specific faiths, or if there's more than one dominant, I'll mention both of them. I'll comment on other things, but those are the two general things. What is the proportion, for example, of Catholics in Poland? Maybe I'll tell you the overall number, but I'm just trying to give you an example of where they dominate. That's the main thing I'm trying to get at here. I may not tell you the same details in every case. Well, I'm going to start with Roman Catholicism first, because as you may have imagined, it dominates Christianity still today, despite the Reformation, despite the break with the Byzantine world about 1,000 years ago, or wherever you want to start that break. It still is, in terms of overall numbers and geography, the most dominant form of Christianity. So let's start with Roman Catholicism in Europe. I could go to Poland, but I'm going to start over here with Ireland. Ireland has only a population of 5.1 million people. I'm not including Northern Ireland. And of this, 78.3% are Roman Catholic. Now, how much does that mean? I mean, they just legalized abortion, so are all of those people really serious about it? I don't want to make moral inferences here about their abortion, like opposing abortion, therefore equals Catholicism. It may be a bit more nuanced than that, but generally you wouldn't expect abortion to be legalized in a country which is 78.3% Roman Catholic, apparently. But anyways, and then there's only small proportions of other groups. I mean, there are almost 10% of the population does not identify as any religious adherent. Now, I could go to England, but it's not as much. That's more of a Protestant place. I don't know about Scotland because I'm dealing with UK as a whole. But we'll come back to that when we're looking at Protestants. But Poland is a heavily Catholic country. Out of 38.4 million people in the total population of Poland, 85.9% are Catholic. That's almost completely Roman Catholic with just a tiny sliver of Greek Catholic, Armenian Catholic, and Byzantine Slavic Catholic. Orthodox are only 1.3% in Poland. Unspecified 12.1%. So this is not something you would see in most Muslim countries. You would not see unspecified categories. You would not see none categories. We have Lithuania. And Lithuania is a small country, only 2.7 million people, but of that number, 77.2% are Roman Catholic. Russian Orthodox, only 4.1% in Lithuania. However, about 16% of the population is either unspecified or no religion, in the superficial sense. And that's an interesting question mark for me. What's going on in Lithuania? Perhaps it just means they didn't get information from that other section of the population. So I'm not really sure. Germany, with its 80.5 million, I think Germany is the single most populous country in Europe, I believe. But of that 80.5 million, only 28.2% are Roman Catholic. Close behind them, the Protestants are 26% of Germany. So this is just slightly over 50% Christian, only 1.9% Orthodox. So there's still not much beyond 50% Christian in Germany. They say that Muslims are only 5% of the German population. Wow, it says 37% of Germans express as no religion. That's astounding. German is even less religious than the United Kingdom. France, out of 67.4 million people, between 63 to 66% are Christian, of which Roman Catholicism is overwhelmingly dominant. It doesn't say exactly the percent, but then Muslims, 7 to 9% of the population in France. Tiny groups of other religions, and then no religion as between 23 to 28%. Another huge chunk. Not quite as large as in Germany, but a huge chunk of the population doesn't care about religion. I don't mean that to say that they dislike religion, but it's like maybe they're agnostics or meh. It's not like religion was ever really part of Western civilization, right? It's not like there was this idea of Christendom and that was one of the pillars of our world, but meh. France, despite that, it's still in a better position culturally than the UK or Germany, because even though it has this huge chunk of non-religious people, it still has twice the numbers of people who are practically all Roman Catholics. So that bodes well for the cultural survival of the French nation in some form in the future. Let's look at Italy. Oh my goodness, here's the Vatican City. And in Italy, of 62.3 million people in their population, 83.3% are Roman Catholic, with very small groups of Jehovah's Witnesses and Protestants. Muslims are at 3.7% in Italy, about 12% unaffiliated, so not quite this large chunk of non-religious, but still a large chunk, but I mean by Muslim standards, but much less than in Germany and France. So you don't have this huge group of non-religious, you just have kind of a noticeable number of them. The Italian culture, the Italian nation, this bodes well for them in terms of more coherence, more cultural coherence for the future, less diversity. I mean, obviously everyone's being affected by the migration from North Africa and the Middle East. Italy has its share of that, of course. But still, it's one thing to be inundated by migrants. It's another thing to be inundated by migrants and your group doesn't even have good coherence. That's even worse. And let's go to Portugal, because Portugal might not have as many people. Well, we'll go to Spain, of course. 49.3 million people in Spain. Of that number, 68.9% are Roman Catholic. So that's still fairly a dominant majority, although it's getting a little low. I mean, you might want to watch that. Atheists are at 11.3%, agnostics 7.6%, non-believers 8.2%. You've got to be concerned about that, but we all do. I'm no one to speak as a Canadian. It's not like we're doing any better, just so you know, we're doing even worse. We're doing far worse in Canada. When it comes to Portugal, of a population of 10.4 million people, Roman Catholics are 81%. There aren't really any other large numbers of other religions. We're going to look at Switzerland. It was diverse before there was diversity. They had people from an Italian background and then a French background, the Swiss background, and then another native Swiss group. Switzerland has 8.3 million people. 35.9% are Roman Catholic. 23.8% are Protestant. Other Christians, 5.9%. Muslim, 5.4%. None, 26%. So, Austria has almost just a bit more people than Switzerland. It has 8.8 million people in Austria. Catholics are 73.8%. Almost all of that is Roman Catholic. Protestants, just less than 5% of the population. There's not really any. There's only 12% as no religion. In total, about 14% of people who aren't religious or are not identifying, with Christianity, but they're not Muslims or anything like that. So that's interesting. Austria has much more religious coherence than Switzerland does, with that large Catholic section. And then moving to Hungary, and they have 9.8 million people in Hungary. Of this number, 37.2% are Roman Catholic. But then they have Calvinists at 11.6%, small number of Lutherans, Greek Catholics, none as 18.2%, and no response as 27.2% gave no response. This adds up to roughly 40% of the population in Hungary being non-religious or just not committed enough to give a response. Maybe because where Hungary is where the Catholic world starts to end. Because then once we get into Romania, once we get into the Balkans, it all changes. Croatia and Slovakia are heavily Catholic, but they're sort of on the border world. So Croatia has 4.3 million people. But of that number, 86.3% are Roman Catholic. Orthodox, a little more than 4%. Muslims are only 1.5%, so it is a Catholic country overall. And Croatia is an interesting contrast with some of the other countries in the Balkans. You'll see why Yugoslavia had to disintegrate. But before that, let's look at Slovakia over here. In the town of Zvolen, futuristic looking chairs. In this interesting country, we have about a total population of 5.4 million people. 62% are Roman Catholic, 8.2% are Protestant, Greek Catholics 3.8%. Again, you have about a quarter of the people in Slovakia don't care about religion. And we didn't see that in Croatia. We only saw a small number of religious, non-religious or atheists or unspecifieds in Croatia. They were less than 6% of the population. In Slovakia, it's about 25, it's about a quarter of the people. What's going on? Once you get more into the continent of Europe, religiosity seems to decrease. I'm going to look at Slovenia, if I can find it here. Small country, only 2.1 million people. Catholics are 57.8%. Unspecified or other as 23% of the population. None as 10.1%. Now, we could continue with the Catholic world, but I think you've seen enough Catholic for now. We'll come back to the Western Hemisphere, then we'll look at Catholics again. And now we're entering the Orthodox world. It's mostly one Orthodox church. I mean, there are certain categories, but it's not splintered in any way like Protestant churches are. So Kazakhstan has a significant number of Orthodox, even though it's kind of far away. I mean, it's a majority Muslim country. It's 70.2% Muslim. Of their 18.7 million people, 26.2% are Christian, and that is mainly Orthodox. Turkmenistan, way out here, it is Muslim 89%. So Turkmenistan is clearly a Muslim country, but they do have Eastern Orthodox at 9%. So there's a small chunk of Eastern Orthodox. Russia. Moscow. Somewhere in Moscow. Oh wow, look what a place to land. Russia, of a population of 142.1 million people, 15 to 20% approximately are Russian Orthodox. And this really surprised me because I thought Russia would have a much larger number of Orthodox, but that's all they have. And Muslims are 10 to 15% of the population. I guess that's because of their proximity with Asian countries. And there aren't really any large numbers of other Christian groups in Russia. It says, note, estimates are of practicing worshippers. Russia has large populations of non-practicing believers and non-believers. Oh, okay, so they don't go to church, but they believe. They say a legacy of over 7 decades of official atheism under Soviet rule. Russia officially recognizes Orthodox Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism as the country's traditional religions. So they don't have one official religion? Even though the Orthodox are only 15 to 20% of the Russian population, they still represent one of the largest concentrations of Orthodoxy in the world, perhaps the largest. And that percentage, even though it's low, it represents at least 21 million people. Now if we go to Romania, 21.4 million people, 81.9% of that is Eastern Orthodox. The rest breaks down mostly into Protestants or Roman Catholics, so that is a heavily Christian country and overwhelmingly Orthodox. There are only basically 4 countries where this situation shows itself. Romania is one of them. We'll see a few others. Serbia is another, but before we go that, we'll look at Belarus. 9.5 million people. Orthodox are 48.3%, Catholic 7%, and then a huge chunk, 41.1% of non-believers. That's amazing. What's going on? When you move towards Russia, the religiosity was destroyed. When you move further south, you get more religiosity. You get more religiosity in Southern Europe, it seems, with Italy, France, to an extent Spain. The Balkan world is far more religious than any of the northern countries. And I mean northern Western countries or northern Eastern countries. I mean Eastern in the sense of Eastern Europe. They all have huge chunks of whatever, agnostic, atheist, I don't care, like no religion. So anyways, Belarus, still a good Orthodox chunk though, we don't mean to dismiss that. That is almost 50% of their population. So it still is the only religion which dominates in those sorts of numbers. It's not vying with any other religion other than its own collapse into non-religiousness, for lack of a better word. So Greece would be one of those countries I was mentioning earlier where the Orthodox does dominate. Of 10.7 million people in Greece, 81 to 90% are adherents of Greek Orthodox, which is the official religion. Muslims only 2%. Although none do account for 4 to 15%. I don't know why there are these large margins. I'm not sure what's up with that. Still, that's overwhelmingly Greek Orthodox. Now we're noticing that these dominant Orthodox countries don't exactly have large populations because they're smaller countries. That is one thing you could point out. Serbia has only 7.1 million people. Of this number, 84.6% are Orthodox. Catholics are only 5%. There's not really anything else worth mentioning. So Serbia is another member of the solid Orthodox bloc. If we go to Bulgaria, of their population of 7.1 million, haven't we seen that before? Bulgaria apparently has the exact same population as Serbia. However, in Bulgaria, Eastern Orthodox is only 59.4% of the population. Muslims are close to 8%. And then a huge chunk, 27.4%, is unspecified, whatever that means. You could say Bulgaria is still a majority Orthodox. They're not vying with any other major group of religion. I can only say they're not vying when they don't have a specific religion challenging them, because I don't see agnostics and atheists as an open challenge. That's sort of like they come from the same ethnic group, but then the children or the grandchildren don't carry on the practice, but they're from the same ethnic background. That's why they could come back to it in the future, but it's not an open, it's a challenge, don't get me wrong, but it's not an open challenge like Islam or Hindus or something like that coming in. Georgia, it's this country is this narrow country in here. They only have 4 million people, but of that number, 83.4% are Orthodox. Muslims are 10% of the population. In Georgia, it's right on the edge of the Muslim world. And then, of course, Ukraine was a bit more murky. I wasn't sure what exactly was going on with that. I mean, Ukraine is sort of a hot-button country with a hot-button history. In Ukraine, of almost 44 million people, all it says is Orthodox under the statistics. It doesn't give any percentage. It says, note, Ukraine's population is overwhelmingly Christian. The vast majority, up to 2/3, identify themselves as Orthodox. Many do not specify a particular branch. They don't mention any large groups of non-religious people or anything like, or no, none. They don't mention anything like that in Ukraine. So we have basically almost covered the entire Orthodox world. I mean, I'm only mentioning all the countries in which they form significant numbers. I mean, of course, there's Orthodox people across the world, but I'm just mentioning the principal countries. We're going to look at the Far East. We're going to look at South and North America. But first, we have to finish Europe because of the Protestants. Protestantism started in Germany. We saw there was a chunk of Protestants closely with Catholics in Germany, but Protestants do not dominate Germany. They used to dominate England. I couldn't really get clear statistics here, but of the United Kingdom, which of course does not include Ireland, it includes Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales. So of their 65.1 million people, 59.5% are Christian. This includes Anglican, Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, and Methodist. It does not mention the specific percentages. I'm assuming England is mostly Anglican, and then you'll have more Presbyterians in Scotland or the Methodists. I don't know where the Methodists fit in. Muslims are at about 4.4%, Hindu 1.3%, none 25.7%, unspecified 7.2%. So it's a huge chunk of non-religious people. Again, nothing unusual now. So even as a formerly Protestant country, it looks like that has drastically changed. Sweden, 10 million people, 60.2% of the population adhere to the Church of Sweden, which is Lutheran. Another section, 8.5%, include Catholics, Orthodox, Baptist, Muslim, Jewish, and Buddhist. None or unspecified at 31.3%. So even though they do have this dominant adherence to Lutheranism, there's this huge chunk of non-religious. So you gotta question this religiosity a little bit in the statistics. Right, the Netherlands has 17.2 million people. Catholics are 23.6%. Protestants are only 14.9% today. So maybe I was wrong. Maybe Netherlands was not originally so Protestant, but 50.7% have no religion or don't care to say anything. 50.7%, and that's in not a tiny country, I mean tiny spatially, but it has 17 million people. Roughly 8.6 million Dutch people are non-religious. I mean, Northern Europe was obviously more Protestant. We looked at Sweden. If you look at Finland, of only 5.5 million people, Lutherans are 69.8% of the population, although unspecified account for 27.4%. There are no other large religious groups, though, so that's good. Norway, 5.4 million people, 70.6% are members of the Church of Norway, which is Evangelical Lutheran, the official religion. There's an unspecified group of 17%. If you go to Denmark, 5.8 million people. Lutherans are 74.7% of the population. I'm not sure. There's this 19.8% chunk of Denmark, which is a huge mix of everything, and I'm not even going to read it out for you, so I'm not really sure what's going on with that. They have about 5.5% Muslim. Latvia, which is a country I have, my mother's side of the family came from this country. Tiny country, only 1.9 million people. 36.2% of the population are Lutheran. Roman Catholics at 19.5%. Orthodox at 19.1%. So it's more Lutheran in Latvia, but they would be outnumbered by the Catholics and Orthodox together. So Latvia has no dominant religion, but you could say that it is dominantly Christian. So it's Christian vaguely in that sense. Estonia is not in any sense even on the list for Protestantism. We'll look at that. Only 1.2 million people. Orthodox are 16.2%. Lutheran almost 10%. No religion as 54.1%, unspecified 16.7%. That is enormous. That is a huge chunk of non-religious or unspecified people in Estonia. What is going on there? Another random case was Czechia. It used to be called the Czech Republic. 10.7 million people. Roman Catholics are 10.4%. It says other and unspecified 54%. I don't know what this other is in the 54%, but that includes unspecified. And then they say none for 34.5% of Czechia. That is a gigantic chunk of non-religious people. In fact, Czechia, with more people than any Baltic country, has a huge chunk of non-religious people. So if you're from the Czech Republic, are you just inherently not enthusiastic about Christianity? I mean, maybe they've had a bad cultural history with Christianity. This is where Jan Hus and the Hussites rebelled. It was kind of like a proto-Reformation. The Protestants today, which include Hussites, is only 1.1%. So obviously, you see, the Protestant Reformation, what we're seeing here is that it failed, it splintered, it didn't produce a sustainable, coherent culture that would reproduce itself over more than a few centuries. It burned itself out. The Catholic world is still going strong, relatively speaking. It's been inundated. It has receded somewhat, but it's still going strong compared to the Protestant world. The Protestant world is diffuse, it's splintered, it's mostly low population areas. Now that'll change when we go to the United States. So that's the asterisk. The United States is the only area in the world where there is still a large number of Protestants. Actually, there's a large number of Protestants in Africa, so that's not entirely true that the US is the only heavy concentration of Protestants. Of the US population of 329.2 million, 46.5% identify as Protestant. Roman Catholics are at 20.8% of the population. Small numbers of Jewish, Mormon, other Christians, just tiny numbers. Unaffiliated, 22.8%. So that's high, but it's not nearly as high as Czechia. We were looking at the UK, where there's these huge numbers of unaffiliated people. I mean, that's still high for the US, but you can see that once you come to the US, depending on where you are, you're going to be in much more religious culture. And you can include Australia just barely on the list for Protestant countries, but not really. Australia has 23.5 million people. Only 23.1% are Protestant. And that's, Anglican United Church. That's the other thing, of course, you have to keep in mind when we're looking at Protestant is, as you know, it's not just like in Roman Catholics where they don't really have denominations in Catholicism, in Roman Catholicism. They have tiny some differences in Orthodox, but much more unity. But in Protestantism, it means all these other churches. Presbyterian, Reformed, Baptist, Pentecostal, Lutheran, etc., etc. The Catholics in Australia are at 22.6%, so that's basically the same number as the Protestants have. And none is 30.1% or unspecified 9.6%. So again, they have that same huge number of non-religious people. So that's it basically for the Protestant world. There's only one other country in the world which you could say is dominantly Protestant, and that would be Jamaica, which is a tiny island. It only has 2.8 million people, but 64.8% of the population are Protestant, but of course that's Seventh-day Adventist, Pentecostal, other churches of God, New Testament Church of God, Baptist, Church of God in Jamaica, Church of God of Prophecy, Anglican, United Church, Methodist, etc., etc. You get the idea. But it is still, vaguely a Protestant country. Rastafarian only 1.1%. So you hear of Jamaica being this Rasta land, but Rastas are never, it's like Rastafarianism is never going to be a dominant religion anywhere because Rastafarianism is just guys who like to smoke a lot of weed. So isn't that funny? Jamaica, the Rasta country, but no, actually Rastafarians are only 1.1%. So there you go. I left out an important exception. If you go to South Korea, I'm not even looking at North Korea because North Korea is so messed up. Who knows? I mean, obviously, I don't know. I'm not assuming missionaries had any success in the North. Well, maybe before the war, but South Korea has 51.4 million people. I stand corrected. It's not a Protestant majority country, but they do have 19.7% of the population Protestant. Again, there must be diversity within that figure, but that's interesting. And then there are almost 8% of South Korea is Catholic. Buddhists are at 15.5%, and then none at 56.9%. So that's interesting that these East Asian advanced economies also have the same non-religious chunks of people that Europe has, and to an extent other Western countries have. Similar cultural, I don't want to call it necessarily decadence, but there's this sort of falling away from belief or adherence. But then again, they didn't really have that sort of religious, they didn't have monotheistic faiths in the past, so maybe I can't exactly say, maybe it's not exactly the same thing. We can't say South Korea is dominantly Christian, but it does stand out. That's a huge number of people which are Christian in South Korea. Roughly 28% of the population is Christian. That's interesting for the Asian world, for the East Asian world. I mean, only the Philippines can really rival that. The Philippines is mostly Catholic, but you don't see that in Japan. Like, look, in Japan, which has a huge, much bigger population, only 1.5% of Japanese are Christian. And in China, now granted, China has an enormous population. China is 5.1% of the population in China is Christian. But of course, that section represents about 70 million people. So you could say there's a significant number of Christians in China. Christianity made inroads into some places in East Asia, but it was definitely kept out of most of East Asia. They resisted Christianity. The Chinese have largely resisted it too, but China's so big that Christianity is still, from what I've heard, it's been growing. But then I also know that the government kind of cracks down and you're not even allowed to worship publicly in many places. Papua New Guinea is actually mostly Protestant and Roman Catholic, but Papua New Guinea is only 7 million people. Protestants 64.3%, Roman Catholic 26%. So, I mean, it was colonized by the British and the Germans. That would probably explain why. So we've basically covered the entire Protestant world. We've looked at some random cases in between. Oh, when it comes to Africa, this is something that I'm not going to go into in this video because this video is already pretty long, but I did do a separate video on this. I looked at how Christianity and Islam stack up to each other in Africa, doing the same sort of statistical analysis I'm doing right now. So I'm not going to go into all the specifics. If you want to know more about that, I'll leave the link to the video in the description, but just to summarize, there are millions and millions of Protestants and Catholics in Africa. They dominate West Africa, they dominate Central Africa, much of Southern Africa, some of East Africa. East Africa is almost half Muslim, and then all the Sahara region and north is all dominant Muslim, and then of course we get the Middle East, Central Asia, that's all Muslim, we know that. And there's probably several hundred million Christians in Africa. And of that number, it breaks down pretty evenly between Catholics and Protestants. I mean, there's certain differences. Ghana is mostly Protestant, but there are Catholic churches. Nigeria, I'm not sure. It's probably similar. There's a lot of evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, charismatic churches. But then those were the British colonies. Most of Africa was under the control of the French, so the French spread Catholicism. So if you go to the Congo, it would probably be mostly Catholic people. But then you get into Tanzania, Somalia is all Muslim, but you get into Tanzania, Kenya, you're looking at a situation where Christian and Muslim breaks down almost 50-50. In terms of overall numbers, in terms of future potential growth, Africa is actually one of the promising areas for Christianity in the sense of getting more adherents, more influence in the future. So when it comes to Brazil, 208.8 million people, 64.6% are Roman Catholic. There are Protestants at 22.2% of the population, and that is a large section. You don't see that in too many other European countries. But still, overwhelmingly Catholic. Well, that's more than 100 million Catholics. If you go to Argentina, 44.7 million people, 92% are nominally Roman Catholic, although it says less than 20% practicing. Protestants only 2%. So Argentina is far more convincingly Catholic than Brazil. Chile, 17.9 million people, although it's a thin country. 66.7% are Roman Catholic. Another 16.4% are evangelical or Protestant. None are at 11.5%. So that's still convincingly religious, a very Christian country. Uruguay is only 3.4 million people. 47.1% are Roman Catholic. Atheist or agnostic, 17.2%. Well, Venezuela, 31.7 million people. 96% are nominally Roman Catholic. Protestants only 2%. If we go to Colombia, of 48.2 million people, 79% are Roman Catholic. 14% are Protestant. Colombia is a heavily Christian country. Peru, in this land of mountains and rainforests and deserts, there are 31.3 million people. 60% of those are Roman Catholic. Another 14.6% identify as Christian, so something other than Roman Catholic but Christian. Unspecified are 21.1%. Now, I know a bit more about Peru. I know there's obviously a lot of traditional, so-called indigenous traditions. I mean, especially among people who speak Quechua as their primary language. Ecuador, 16.5 million people in Ecuador. 74% are Roman Catholic. 10.4% are evangelical. They say there's some small numbers of Buddhists, Jewish, and spiritualist, Muslim, Hindu, so that's interesting. But that's probably in the big city or something. And then atheist, 7.9%, that's interesting. It seems to have a tiny bit of cosmopolitanism in there. I'm not looking at Suriname, French Guyana, sorry. These populations are extremely low. I'm going to jump ahead in the same topic of Catholics in the world to Canada, which you would have thought would have perhaps still been a Protestant country, at least like Australia. Of a population of 35.8 million people, 39% are Catholic. This includes Roman Catholic at 38.8%. So usually when you hear the word Catholic, it means Roman Catholic. But there's some exceptions, of course. And then Protestant, only 20.3%. Orthodox in Canada are only 1.6%. Other Christian, 6.3%, whatever that means. Muslim, 3.2%. Hindu, 1.5%. Sikh, 1.4%. Buddhist, 1.1%. Jewish, 1%. Other, 0.6%. None, 23.9%. So again, that familiar quarter chunk. It's like in all these countries, they have the quarter chunk. It's like you're going to be a Western country in the 21st century. It's like you got to take your quarter chunk of agnosticism and non-religiousness. Take your quarter chunk. The Muslim world, they take a 99% chunk. It's like, no, we're not having any of this sectionality. We're all got to be on the same page in a Muslim country. We all get on the same page. The men run the show. The women have their place. For better or for worse, honestly, I'm just saying, for better or for worse. That's just the situation there. Canada has the quarter chunk. But they're more like the United Kingdom. They're less religious than the USA. Except for this Catholic thing, that's a huge chunk. I mean, you know what a lot of it must be is now Portuguese people, because they're Catholic. A lot of Asians who've come over, maybe they're Catholic. So a lot of the immigrants coming over, like from Latin America, they're Catholic, we've seen, so they're coming to Canada. All these countries basically lost their Protestant dominance. Even in the US, they're slightly less than 50% of the population. So obviously humans can come together from more levels than just religion. I don't mean to be suggesting that. But it's an important aspect to look at and to take into consideration. It does have some effects. We'll take it down from Mexico. They have 126 million people in Mexico, and 82.7% are Roman Catholic. There's a 5% section of evangelical. So that's more Catholics coming into the United States now. Then if we go to Guatemala, and I know Guatemalans come into the United States as well, it is 16.6 million people. That's comparable to the Netherlands. And they don't say, they just say Roman Catholic, Protestant, Indigenous, Maya. So we don't really know, but I visited here a bit, and I mean, it's like Latin America. It's Catholic. But when they say Indigenous Maya, yeah, that's true too. I mean, just like in Peru. I didn't look at El Salvador, but it's going to be Catholic. Honduras is 9.2 million people. 46% are Roman Catholic. 41% are Protestant. So that's interesting. That's like an even section there. 6.1 million people in Nicaragua. 50% are Roman Catholic. 33.2% are evangelical. That's interesting. So once you get into Central America, you could say that Protestants have established effective bases in Central America. I mentioned this briefly, but I didn't go into it, was the Philippines, which is way more people than South Korea. There's a lot of Christians in South Korea, but by far, way by far, there are more in the Philippines. But they are Catholics, because the Philippines was part of the Spanish Empire for a long time. And there are today 105.9 million people in the Philippines. 80.6% are Roman Catholic. Protestants, 8.2%. Muslims, 5.6% in the Philippines. I didn't look at Belgium, however. Belgium. They actually have 11.6 million people. 50% are Roman Catholic, and then that's pretty much it. 32.6% of Belgians claim no religion or just none. There's 5% Muslim. There's not really any other significant numbers of anything else. What the hell's going on in Belgium too? Kind of a similar situation to the Netherlands, not quite as extreme. If you go to Vietnam, this country is 97 million people. Catholics are 6.6%, so there is a good number of Catholics in Vietnam, a fair minority. But however, Buddhists are only 7.9%, and there's not really any other religious group. In Vietnam, 81.8% of the population claims no religion. Maybe that's just, they're not filling it out, they're not being honest, I don't know. Or that just shows that in East Asia it's a bit different with this whole religion thing. People don't really subscribe to that sort of thing. They probably do have traditional practices and certain beliefs, but they just don't think about it as a religion, so that's why they don't claim anything. Or it could be partly because Vietnam is communist. I'm going to just look at one more interesting, and then just to give you a small sample, very tiny sample of some Muslim countries, just to give you an idea. But India is an interesting case. It's 1 billion people, let's just say 1.2 billion. Hindus are the dominant majority, almost 80% of the population. Muslims are 14% of the population, but Christians are 2.3% of India's population, so that does represent some millions of people, probably more than 10 million people. So just to give you a small sample of what happens in Muslim countries, and I mean on the border between the Muslim world and the European world or Western world, we have Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of 3.8 million people, Muslims are 50.7% of the population. So they're just over half of the population. Orthodox are 30.7%. Catholics, 15.2%. And then Albania. Albania only has 3.1 million people. Muslims are 56.7% of that number. Catholics are only 10%. Orthodox, just less than 7%. So clearly this is now a Muslim majority country. And then once you get to Turkey, We already looked at Greece, that was majority Orthodox. So even Greece is kind of like holding out. We looked at Greece, it was majority Orthodox by far. And it's holding out in a world which is kind of on several sides pretty Muslim. I mean, it can say, oh, well, there's lots of Christians in Bulgaria. It's not like in Italy, it's like, okay, we're still the heart of the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire, and we've got Europe backing us up. It's like, no, in Greece, they're kind of, enveloped by Islam. Turkey, I mean, look at Turkey. This is a country which, of its 81.3 million people, which is similar to Germany's population, which is way more than any other European country. I mean, only Germany has about it's in the 80s. I think it's a little more. And it's 99.8% Muslim, mostly Sunni. That's incredible. So the reason I'm speaking in an animated tone is after everything we've looked at, this is now something new. 99.8%. Have you heard me say that statistic? You have not, because we have not seen that anywhere else in the world. That is an incredible coherence. And I know in Turkey there's people who don't like Erdogan, and some of the Turkish people disagree. And obviously it has its divisions, but you can see culturally there's still a huge cultural unity. And that's impressive. I gotta hand it to. But I don't think it's just that it's Turkey. I think we would start to see a similar in the high 90s. Like I saw that when I was looking at Africa and some of these Muslim countries. It's like, yeah, it's in the high 90s of all the Muslim people. In fact, it's like probably less than 1% or 2% of the non-Muslims in these countries. And that's all it's going to be. Everyone else is going to be probably belonging to one sect of Islam. That's probably mostly it. So they have an incredible coherence in the Muslim world. I just wanted to give you a little taste of that. We're not going to go into that. In summary, my reflections upon analyzing this data, I may just rephrase some of the things I've already said, or maybe just add a few more final things to say. Taking this all together, of the three major branches of Christianity, Roman Catholics have the largest number of adherents across the world, and unsurprisingly, they also dominate a far greater landmass than any other Christian group. They dominate Western Europe, except for England, and they dominate Central Europe, though their numbers are not overwhelming in Central Europe. Roman Catholic dominance is far stronger in the Western Hemisphere, from Mexico down to Brazil. Although, interestingly, there are these sizable Protestant minorities in numerous Latin American countries. And then in East Asia, this Christian beachhead in Asia, to an extent South Korea, but mostly the Philippines, and a little bit in Vietnam. There is a Christian triangle, or even with China, a quadruple, triangle-ish relationship. Catholics also have a large number of adherents in Africa. Protestants also dominate in Africa. So far behind the Catholics comes the Eastern Orthodox. But I would list the Eastern Orthodox still as having more integrity and potential for the future than the Protestant world. Their influence in Russia was decimated by the Soviet Union. It hasn't fully recovered. As we mentioned, it sits at around 15 to 20% of the population, but that is 21 million people. The four countries which are overwhelmingly Orthodox, meaning over 75% are Orthodox, those are Greece, Serbia, Romania, and Georgia. Orthodox Christianity is the largest player in more than half of Eastern Europe. This gives them a firm geopolitical position and a sense of security that the Protestant world does not enjoy. The Orthodox world is still going to be around in a century, in 2 centuries, in 3 centuries, dare I say, and longer than that. But Protestant influence is in the most decimated condition in the West, although it's strongest in the United States, but still not good condition. You could argue that Protestants still have more influence in the world than the Orthodox, as things stand right now, because they certainly have far more people. There are far more Protestants in the world than there are Orthodox. Orthodox never really did this huge missionary thing that Protestantism did, or Catholicism did. They were the ones that did most of the mission. I mean, I'm sure the Orthodox did their missionary work in the section of the world where they dominate, in Eastern Europe and Russia, and part of Asia. I mean, sure, there's small sections around the world, but that's more of a recent phenomenon. In the 18th, 19th century, there were no Orthodox going to Canada or the US. I mean, you could maybe find some random examples, sure, but it wasn't a big thing at all. These were areas that were almost completely colonized by Catholics and Protestants. And that it goes for Africa too. There's no Orthodox in Africa. So basically today, from Germany to England to Canada to Australia, the Protestant world today is splintered, and that's been par for the course ever since Martin Luther sparked the Reformation. The difference today is that in addition to being splintered between different kinds of Protestants, they are also increasingly marginalized by the rise of either Roman Catholics or non-Christians like Muslims or Hindus, and at the same time, even in their descendants of the original Protestant Europeans, they have collapsed into atheism, agnosticism, New Age, nature worship, etc. And that's an interesting, unique, somewhat troubling and sad phenomenon. Hasta luego, amigos!